Hello everyone from Helsinki, Finland, and welcome to this webinar entitled Masculinities as a Tool to Wellbeing and Empowerment. This webinar is the first event of a webinar series called On Men and Masculinities from Change and Crisis to Empowerment, which is organized jointly by the Council for Gender Equality and the Central Association of Men's Organizations in Finland, and made possible with the funding by the Nordic Council of Ministers. My name is Tane, Riski, and next to me is
Joonas Kekkonen.
And we will be moderating today's event together. You can see today's program on the screen now, but before we get started, I would like to go over a few housekeeping issues. First of all, you can make comments and ask questions from the speakers throughout this event, starting from now by using the chat box available on the screen. So please feel free to say hello and start chatting. Our colleagues on the other side of the studio are moderating the chat. We have a quite turnout for this event, about 170 registered participants, but that means that we might not be able to provide airtime to all questions and comments and have the speakers respond to all of them. But as you can see in the program, we have a questions and answers session in the end of the program, so that will hopefully enable us to have an exchange and dig deeper in some of the topics that will be discussed today. Another practical note I want you to take note of is that we will also take a small break after the second speaker, and we'll notify you again on the screen when the time comes. And lastly, this event will also be recorded, and the recording will be available on the YouTube channel of the Council for Gender Equality. Our colleagues will note down the address in the chat right now if they haven't done it already. And if you have any other practical questions or queries about the program or this webinar series, just use the chat for any remarks. Now a few words about the content. The aim of this webinar series is to spark debate and share knowledge among researchers, policymakers, and civil society representatives about working with men and masculinities in relation to gender equality in the Nordic and Baltic countries and beyond. At the moment, we are witnessing many challenges in our gender equality efforts. We are living somewhat turbulent times that affect us all as members of society. These webinars provide a forum to discuss how the existing, but also the changing social norms, attitudes, and gender stereotypes impact men and boys in particular, and how the ongoing social transformation can be used, despite the challenges, to harness positive change in society. The discussion today will focus on the practical work done with boys and men and how the different approaches to masculinities can be used as a tool to support and empower men. You will hear examples of male-focused or gender-sensitive approaches on working with men and boys and what approaches have proved promising. But I think I will now turn to Joonas, who will lead us through the program and introduce our first speaker.
Thank you. We have three speakers from Lithuania, Finland, and Estonia today. And our first speaker is Antanas Grižas. He's the CEO and co-founder at Gentys, which means tribes. This is a Lithuanian organization. They focus on building spaces dedicated to men's personal growth, mutual support, and community. They offer a variety of groups and events, from short intensive programs to long-term personal growth groups to men's summer festivals. And their programs and groups, their tribes, have gone on to different countries in Europe. So their success has been great in last decade. Antanas' topic today will be men building their own tribes and learning to open up. Antanas will join us online. So, Antanas, welcome to our webinar. Now it's your turn.
So it's a pleasure to be the first one to speak in this webinar series. Such an honor. Thank you, organizers, for making this possible. I'm excited that more and more discussions are happening around helping and empowering men. So I'm saying hello from Vilnius, Lithuania. I'm a clinical psychologist, founder and CEO of our project called Tribes, where we focus on reaching mainstream men and empowering them to have more emotional intimacy, more emotional literacy, and more positive relationships in their lives. Next slide. Today, I will shortly introduce the story of our project, and I'll also share some insights and, more importantly, questions for discussion about working and reaching mainstream men. Next. So, short story about tribes. Next slide. It all started with this bunch of men. You can see me in the left side holding ice cream. This is my tribe. We gathered in 2018. We knew each other from before, but we all went through some kind of crisis. I think I went through quarter age crisis, where I had a lot of questions what I want to do with my life. I felt lonely. I was changing inside, and I didn't have a lot of friends at the time because some of my old friends didn't fit me, and there weren't new ones yet. I had a lot of questions about romance, courtship with women, about being a family man. And I had a lot of fears that overwhelmed me when I thought about future. And I think my guys from my tribe would say something similar along these lines. So we were fortunate enough to find each other at the right time. And we started just meeting regularly and just sharing and supporting each other. At first, I was skeptical. As a psychologist, I thought that no moderator for such a group, that shouldn't work. But very soon I was convinced that it's super powerful, even though I was going through my own personal psychotherapy for a few years at that time. But this experience was something else. This peer support group with other men helped me reach levels of safety and vulnerability that I haven't reached before. And with time, we started, bragging to other friends about having a tribe. And a lot of our friends, male friends, felt that they also want to get into our tribe. And at that time, I also started thinking about my future career, what I want to do as a psychologist. I realized I want to work in a societal level, help resolve men's suicides, because I saw that majority of suicides are men, and that there aren't enough services tailored for men that would be effective. And I figured that this tribe approach that we are having might work for other men as well. So that is what we started. Next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. So Gentys is our project that we started. It's a Lithuanian name for tribes. And essentially, a tribe is a men's circle, a peer-to-peer support group for up to 11 men, where we meet weekly or bi-weekly for 2 or 3 hours, and they do emotional work. One of the group members asks for time for himself. He shares his struggle, his big life question, and other men support him through empathy, compassion, sharing their own experience, or giving advice. Next slide. And inception of this project was in 2020. And since when we managed to reach 2,500 men across all Lithuania and beyond. We also reached some Lithuanian expats living in other countries. And in the recent year, we also started few groups in UK, where local British people and also immigrants from other countries living in UK participated. And what's important is that different age groups joined, not only young men, not only progressive men, but also senior men. And it was very rewarding for all participants to be in contact with other age groups from other fields, from other cities, and starting having meaningful conversations. Next slide. we developed a facilitation program where we train new facilitators. These facilitators are non-professionals and working on volunteer basis. And that's a very important finding, I think, that I think in Nordic and Baltic countries, there are enough men who would want to do this type of work on voluntary basis. They want to learn new skills to be a group facilitator. They want to make a positive change. They want to help others. They also want to help themselves through facilitating. And that's what we learned, that there are a lot of men who are eager to learn how to lead new tribes, new groups, and also learn new skills along the way. So we actually have much more facilitators than in this slide, but this is just the picture I made some time ago. Next slide. And as Joonas already mentioned, we also delivered Tribes Festival. We did it for 4 years now, during summer, on a weekend in beautiful Lithuanian nature, for 3 days. Around 500 men come every year. They bring their children. We have a lot of sports events, games happening, and most importantly, therapeutic workshops happening during these 3 days. And for majority of men, it's a totally unique and superb experience. For me also, the first time we had this festival, it was mind-blowing that I could be surrounded by 500 men. First of all, that's unique in itself, to be surrounded by 500 men only for the whole weekend. And to feel so safe. Majority of us men, we don't have much experience feeling safe around other men. So that was super healing experience, very important one. And that is why we had this festival for a few years now. We are not sure if we're gonna have this festival going forward, because the business of festival is very difficult, even though it's super fun, but it's very difficult, and it's more difficult to make it profitable so that we could manage to do it year by year. But still, it's something that we are super proud of. Next slide. And this is just a photo of our extended team. I just love this photo, so I wanted to share it with you. I love these guys, and I'm honored to be part of these guys who are dedicated to bonding, positively bonding with other men and helping others. Next slide. Why do we do what we do? So just a short conceptualization of how we see the problem that we want to solve. Next slide. We see that there is a lack of informal community services for men. And it doesn't address only men in crisis, it addresses the majority of men. We see that there is an epidemic of loneliness in our society, and in men specifically. And this loneliness epidemic, we believe it has 2 root causes. One cause is internal, and another cause is external. Internal one is about not having enough skills to build emotional intimacy with myself and with others. And men are not equipped during their growing up to deal with emotions and with emotional intimacy and to create positive emotional intimacy. That is a huge part of men's suffering these days, we believe. And then there is an external part of it, is that throughout the generations, we have more and more fragmented men's social fabric, meaning positive relationships with other men, with other peers. More and more men are lonely, and they're either totally alone in front of a computer, or they're closed off in their close family. But with years, when they finish university, when they start working, start having family, more and more men are just isolated in those silos and have fewer and fewer connections, which becomes a great risk factor over the years. And we focus on mainstream men. We don't focus on crisis men, because we believe we want to create a positive, healthy change in culture of men. We need to tackle the majority of men. We need to tackle the healthy majority, whatever that means, healthy and normal majority. And this is our ambition and aim. We're not perfect in that, but this is what we try to do. Next. Shortly, briefly, I'm going to present you how our tribes work. What is the methodology? Next slide. We have 3 phases. The first phase is when we receive applications and we start matching our applicants together to a potential tribe. When we form the tribe, then we start tribes bootcamp, which is the second phase. This is a 2-month process where our facilitator meets weekly with the group and teaches skills needed for being a valuable participant in a group, teaches team building, and gradually gives ownership of the group. So gradually the members start leading the meetings and not the facilitator. And that's super important because in the third phase, after the bootcamp, the tribe meets independently, autonomously, without a facilitator, and they do it for as long as they need. My tribe, which I'm from, we already meet for almost 8 years. There are other tribes that meet from the beginning of our project, so almost 5 years, and others are also, of course, just in their inception. But this is the unique part of this project, that guys need to pay only for the bootcamp, and after that they have their tribe for the rest of their lives if they need to. And they meet in their homes, in their work, in libraries, near the campsite, wherever they want. And they have these emotional work meetings. Next slide. So this is an outline of this tribe bootcamp. It's 8 meetings during 2 months. And we touch on different important topics, and we work on experiential skills training during those meetings. And also during every of these meetings, we not only touch on topics and discussions and exercises, but there's always time dedicated for emotional work, where one of the members asks time for himself and receives support immediately. Next slide. But to be fair, I want to be humble. Our team wants to be humble. Even though our project is by far the most successful men's project in the Baltics, and we reached the most men than ever there was such a project, we're still scratching the surface, because our ambition is to reach the mainstream men. And from various research, we know that around 20% of men in any given population struggle with emotional connection and with loneliness. Then we only scratching the surface. We managed to reach in Lithuania 2,500 men, but that's just 1.2% of what we would need to reach if we want to make a actually great impact. And I'm sharing this slide because, one, I want to be humble and I want to be realistic. Whatever we are sharing today, not only me, but other initiatives as well, I think we're still in early stages of helping men. I think we're still learning and discovering how to actually reach and approach men and how to create tailored services for them, which actually work, which are effective, which men want to use. So we are proud of what we managed so far to do with tribes, but also this is the question that we're asking ourselves. How do we reach the core of this population? Not only the surface. How do we penetrate deeper into this population? Next slide. So one immediate thing that we are focusing right now as an organization is to create more simple on-demand services, because a tribe as a service, it's very valuable. It's quite popular among men, but currently it asks too much of a commitment from a regular mainstream guy to commit, and a lot of men are not ready for this kind of commitment. The ones who were committed, who joined our programs, are the early adopters, are the most curious, the most brave, the most open-minded, and the most desperate, I could say, even, because they're perhaps in crisis and they want to help themselves. But if we think about the mainstream men, we need to create easier access to them. So we are working on creating on-demand service that you register and you receive right away. And also we need to start thinking beyond community-based services, because it's just one modality. Community-based is just one modality, and we need other modalities, because not all men are ready to go and share and explore their feelings in a group of other men. Next slide. So keeping this in mind, for the remaining part of my presentation, I want to share some insights and some questions for discussion for today, and some initial answers that we already investigate in our team. Next slide. So one question that we are asking ourselves is, okay, we want to reach mainstream men. We assume that a majority of those men are traditionally oriented men. What does a traditional man want? And if we simplify this answer, we probably answer something like this, that he wants to be strong. Most likely he avoids feeling or looking weak. As a consequence, he rarely has adaptive skills to deal with emotional pain. As a consequence, probably he has a lot of emotional pain, but he is avoiding that pain. And he uses avoidance, denial, and numbing techniques to deal with pain. And if we have this kind of persona, this kind of archetype, then we might ask ourselves, how do we reach this man? Next slide. How to approach this man? And there are a few things that our team is convinced that won't work. We are convinced that only targeting men in crisis will not work. It's still important to target men in crisis, because of course men in crisis need help. And this is, I might say, men in crisis are one of the easier populations to reach, because they usually are motivated to help themselves. Their eyes are open that their life is in crisis and they need help. But if we want to reach mainstream men, targeting men in crisis will not work, because a mainstream traditional man doesn't want to be associated with being weak, with being vulnerable. His avoidance and denial defenses will come up, and he will disassociate with this population. He will not listen to these kind of messages and services. Next, we might think that we should criticize strength itself for wanting to be strong, because we see it as impediment to being vulnerable and to being emotionally healthy, but that won't work, because men see strength as a value, and for a good reason. Strength is a very good value to have. We all, men and women, we all need resilience, we all need persistence, we all need consistency, discipline in our lives, and these are form of strength. And it doesn't matter where you live, whether you live in Afghanistan or Uganda or Sweden or Lithuania, you need strength, because life is hard, and men know it. That's why they seek strength in their lives. So we cannot approach men. Men won't listen if we start saying, hey, it's okay to cry, it's okay to be weak, vulnerability is not weakness. They won't listen to it, most likely. Majority of them won't, because they need strength, and they need us to acknowledge strength. And of course, very naturally, we might be persuaded to criticize masculinity, because we see maladaptive forms of traditional masculinity, and we see that this is one of the causes why men suffer, because they want to be strong so bad, they want status, they want to be dominant, that they are not investigating their inner lives, their emotions. But again, there is no elegant way to criticize masculinity, and for a majority of mainstream men to not get offended. They see it, no matter how we word it, no matter how we put it, majority of mainstream men will still see it as an attack to their positive gender identity. And having a positive gender identity is a very important psychological need. So these are the routes that we believe, our team believes, is not the way to go. And then we ask our questions, okay, so how then should we approach these mainstream men? And listen, I don't have perfect answers yet. As I said, we're only scratching the surface. I want to be humble and realistic here, but I want to invite to discuss these things. Maybe you disagree with my points so far, but let's look on. So these are the things that we think might be useful when thinking about services tailored for men and how to start approaching the majority of mainstream men, not just scratching the surface. Next slide, please. What might work? What we are experimenting right now ourselves as a team. And maybe a year from now, I can tell you the results. Next slide. So one thing is actually promoting strength, getting in line with this value of being strong. There's nothing wrong with wanting to be strong. We all need strength. But we need to find ways to promote positive aspects of traditional masculinity with positive aspects and values of good mental health. There is a saying in fitness, no pain, no gain. And I think that it fits perfectly in psychology as well. And that is one way of putting it, of wording it to men to get them more motivated to look inside themselves. If you are not willing to feel the emotional pain that you're feeling, if you're not willing to touch on it, you will not become truly strong. You will not become truly resilient. You will not become mature. If you want to become mature, you need to feel out your emotions, even the painful emotions. And of course, we can say the same about other traditional masculinity values, such as courage, such as persistence, discipline. Of course, these traits are important not only to men, these are important to everybody. But since traditionally oriented men are already in line with these values, we should capitalize on them. And we should motivate them to look inside themselves, to work on their emotional lives through these values, not opposing these values. These are good values. Next slide. Also, one direction we are experimenting and we are convinced that it has a lot of potential is humor. I guess all of us know that an average man really loves humor. That's one definition of a stereotypical man, that he does a lot of jokes. He likes to banter. Majority of stand-up comedians are guys. A majority of audience of stand-up comedians are guys. And humor is an adaptive defense mechanism for emotional pain. And it's actually a good tool to overcome avoidance of pain. And we can start talking with guys about painful topics through humor. It's not easy. Humor is controversial. And there is, good humor and bad humor. And there is tasty humor and not so tasty humor. But I think that's one thing that has really potential. We might, that's what we are planning to do in our project. We want to reach more guys through humor, through stand-up comedy, through memes, where we present very important issues that men come across, but we hook them, we get them interested through humor. And next slide. And my last point is I want to share one framework that we are using, and I think it's very beneficial, and I hope you will find it beneficial as well. I believe this is one answer why our project was successful so far. We differentiate between positive male identity and traditional masculinity. And we believe that having a positive gender identity is a core need, psychological need of human beings. Just as we want women to feel good about being women, we want gay people to be okay about being gay. We want transgender people to feel okay about their preferred gender. We need to make sure that men get enough positive messages about their gender identity. And I believe, and I'm convinced from working with men, that the reason we antagonize men when we criticize masculinity, traditional masculinity, when we use phrases such as toxic masculinity, the majority of men get antagonized. They just shut down and they don't listen immediately. One reason, and that is a very good reason, they try to protect their positive male identity. And positive male identity is when I'm able to say, I'm confident in my masculinity. I respect myself as a man. I feel good being a man. And that is not the same as traditional masculinity, which supposes norms and rules of how should I behave, what should I do. It's different. And having this positive identity is important. It's important to feel good about myself, to have positive regard towards myself. And we know from research and from our experience with tribes that having positive, safe relationship with other men helps to build and grow this positive male identity, because we share about unique male experiences. We let go of a lot of shame around being a man, about male sexuality, about feelings, about experiences that we experience as a man. That helps with our mental health. We have research that shows that it lowers suicidality, and we are convinced that it also helps to promote gender equality because it doesn't antagonize men. Men need to feel respected. And I just don't think that talking with men about criticizing traditional masculinity will help. What we need to criticize is maladaptive behaviors, such as avoiding and numbing pain. That's maladaptive. Abusing myself and others, self-destructive or destructive behaviors. That's maladaptive, but not masculinity itself. So there was my last slide also. I don't know if you're going to show it, but that's okay. I just wanted to say thank you. Yeah, here it is. Thank you. As you can tell, I'm quite passionate about this work, and I'm passionate about looking for unconventional new approaches to addressing this old problem of reaching men in mental health. If you want to do work together, reach out to me. Let's have some good work together. Thank you.
Thank you, Antanas, for your representation here. Well, let's take a quick look at the chat and go on from there. Are men from different minorities included in your tribes, and how do they get there? Sexual minorities, migrants?
So, short answer would be we are inclusive, we are open to it, but we are not actively promoting that. Our main audience is the mainstream heterosexual men from Lithuanian community. But we have homosexual men, we have transgender men, and we have men from other ethnicities. But this is not our main focus. Our main focus is the mainstream man from Lithuania.
Thank you. We'll see you again in the discussion in the end. Thank you.
See you soon.
And now we move on to our next speaker, Harri Lunabba from University of Helsinki, where he works as a university researcher in the field of social work. His teaching focuses on welfare practices and professional encounters, as well as his studies, and he has participated in Finnish discussion on boyhood and masculinities, for example, on topics of education and mental health. His topic today will be recognizing young masculinities, gender-sensitive approaches for supporting boys and young men in practice. Welcome, Harri. The floor is yours.
Hello all, my name is Harri Lunabba and very nice to be here to talk about this very important and dear subject for myself. My title for today is Recognizing Young Masculinities, Gender-Sensitive Approaches for Supporting Boys and Young Men in Practice. My background is that I'm mostly an academic, but I've also worked as a social worker in practice. I will talk most about from a researcher's perspective, but my hope is that my thoughts and ideas will have this sense of practice relevance, and these ideas could be adapted by anyone who is working, for instance, with young men and masculinity, supporting them with some kind of means. But before I go further, I want to say something about the context of my talk. I'm going to mostly focus on my latest international research article. It has a pretty much similar kind of topic that this speak has. It's about recognizing the vulnerabilities of young masculinities in youth work. Now, and what I've done with this paper is that I've conducted ethnographic research in two settings where they have been working with boys and young men by providing different kinds of support. I was first of all working in this rap music workshop that was targeting immigrant young people within the Helsinki area. This was a mixed gender group, but majority of the participants were male, and they provided rap music setting to provide more like inclusive support to engage young men in the Helsinki area. Then I also conducted within the same study at this specialized youth center that worked specifically with boys and young men who need some kind of a support, who need support to develop friendships and get access to spend time with peers. And I conducted research ethnographically, which meant that I participated in these two institutions' daily activities for a longer period of time. I was on the field for approximately 1 year, for at least once a week. And the idea here was to get a very close and practical view on how young men and boys are supported. So this is the context of my talk today, this particular study. But on the other side, I have also this book called Poikatutkimus, which is Finnish for boyhood research. That is also an anthology that we wrote with a few colleagues a few years back. And some of my ideas come from that book as well. But first, a few words about sensitivity. I like the concept sensitivity very much, and it can be obviously understood in various ways. I think it's always good to be sensitive. And sensitive is not weakness. I think sensitivity is everything but weakness. It's also about strength. But what I believe is a good definition, or at least very useful definition for myself, is that I view sensitivity as a practice. It's a practice of acknowledging human vulnerabilities. And once we have this practice that we acknowledge human vulnerabilities, I think we can be sensitive. And when it comes to approaching and encountering boys and young men, I think boys and young men, like all human beings, all groups in society, need or they benefit from sensitivity. But I think it's exceptionally important to remind ourselves that also boys and young men need these sensitive approaches. That is all about acknowledging also their vulnerabilities. Because I think that when we talk about human beings, I think we are quite aware of the fact that everybody hurts sometimes, like REM sings. to live a life is about experiencing pain every once in a while. But when it comes to the discourses of men and masculinities, we most often see them as particularly privileged. And if we see a group as privileged, I think it's more difficult to see them as vulnerable. It is also something that two researchers, Bethany Coston and Michael Kimmel, have analyzed, and they are stating that we sometimes see privilege where it isn't. And they have, for instance, made studies about marginalized masculinities and the intersection of privilege. And I think there is a challenge in the society. I think there's a challenge in the educational setting. I think there's a challenge in the welfare setting. There's particularly a challenge in social work to acknowledge men and masculinities in a sensitive way. And that is all about recognizing their vulnerabilities. And I hope this talk will give you some kind of ideas how we can keep reminding ourselves of this need to be sensitive. But what does it mean in more practical terms? First of all, I would like to address a concept that is quite often talked about when it comes to gender, but for some reason the term intersectionality is not experienced as something that would be beneficial for men. And I would like to argue that intersectionality is a very good concept for understanding gender, and it's also something that men and masculinities, and also young men and masculinities that I have studied, benefit from. And what is intersectionality? It's about a process that reveals how gender interacts with other social categories, race, class, sexuality, ability, etc. And how the varieties of masculinities shape the unique experiences of masculinities. Whereas we see men as privileged, I think that's a very narrow way of understanding a human being, because a man is also something else than just its gender. This was actually something that was very useful when I conducted my PhD studies for more than 10 years ago, and I tried to theoretically understand what it means to be a boy. And my starting point from understanding boys was that I understood them first and foremost as children. And when it comes to understanding children, I think it's quite easy for us to understand them as vulnerable if we, for instance, compare them to adults. Children don't have the same access to power as adults, for instance. But boys and young men are very often also linked to hegemonic masculine categories, which I think reveals this very interesting intersection between being a vulnerable child on one hand and being a part of a hegemonic category. And I think this understanding that we have these different kinds of competing categories, I think it's very interesting because it positions boys and young men in a very particular position. They are not like all men as they are children, but they are not as all children because they are also part of masculinities. And I think this intersectional understanding is very useful. But intersectionality was also very useful when I conducted my studies in this rap music workshop. And I've written about this character in my data who I call Rafik. Rafik was a young man whose parents were from Morocco. And when I met Rafik, he was this very confident and very popular young man in that setting. Everybody knew him, and he was a very gifted rap musician. And when you looked and interacted with Rafik in the rap music workshop, you didn't see him as vulnerable. But when I started to talk about him, more about his life, and he revealed details about what it means to be a 20-year-old Rafik, I get a very different kind of perspective. And I think there was a very interesting contradiction in how Rafik was constructed when we compared how Rafik was perceived in the streets of Helsinki, or how he explained that people see him, and the story of himself that he told himself, or how he identified himself. First of all, Rafik said that everybody thinks that I have just moved here. But the fact was that he had been living in Finland since he was 2. He said that everybody thinks that as he doesn't know Finnish language, in many practical settings, people started to talk English to him as the first alternative, even though he was in Finland. But the fact is that Finnish was his first language. People perceived that he was living on social benefits, that he was someone who got his money from the social office. But the fact is that Rafik was an entrepreneur and an artist, taking actually quite high risk with his personal economics. He was very often seen as the immigrant. But when I talked to Rafik, he talked more about how he grew up being the class clown. So I think this is a quite interesting example of the intersections in Rafik's lives, how he's perceived in different contexts, and particularly how his lives intersected with being the king of the rap music workshop and being the so-called immigrant out in the street of Helsinki. Very different kinds of positions. And from what I came to learn about Rafik's lives, he didn't appear to be vulnerable, but when I got to know him, there was many reasons for me to see his vulnerabilities. So, what I would really much like to suggest how we could be more sensitive and be more recognized more vulnerabilities also among masculinities. I think there's one very easy way to start. I think we have a tendency when we talk about gender to apply this kind of a hierarchic framework. But I would suggest, as also many studies show, that we can also understand masculinities first and foremost from a contextual inequality approach. To be vulnerable is not a competition. It's more about a matter of context, and everybody can experience inequalities in different kind of intersecting contexts. So I think to understand inequalities, I think we need to understand them in a surrounding, in a social context. And that means that we have to understand how the division of power, resources and agency is not something general. It's often very much related to different kinds of institutional settings. And I would argue that there are contexts where masculinities have a minority position, even we very often see them as privileged. There are two contexts that I have been focusing on in my research. The first one is masculinities in education. And I think there are many studies that show that it's not always so good or so nice or so beneficial to be a man or a young man in the educational context. There is also something I believe that is an issue in welfare services. We know that there are many practices that are not perhaps so well thought of when it comes to encountering boys and men in need. This is just a short statistics of the gender division in my own university, Helsinki University. Statistically, boys and men are a minority in the University of Helsinki. This is another picture from a family counseling center in Helsinki, where I visited with my youngest son a few years ago, and it's not unclear who was the expected parent in that counseling center, looking at the new papers that were available in the hall. One thing that I have been talking about very much, and one very practical thing in regards of vulnerabilities is the aspect of loneliness. And I think one form of vulnerabilities that very many men suffer from, which was also mentioned in the previous presentation, is loneliness. What I've been thinking about very much is the combination of how loneliness is related to social agency. And I think the agency is the fact that we individuals have some resources of power. And when it comes to understanding loneliness, I think we generally seem to understand or view loneliness as a manifestation of exclusion and discrimination, but we have not been really much focused on the fact that relationships are most often viewed as mutual. And for instance, to understand an intimate relationship as other as mutual would be a would be oppressive. So I think when we encounter loneliness, I think it's a very interesting contradiction where we, on one hand, need to recognize the devastation of loneliness and the significance of creating safe spaces for all vulnerable groups, including masculinities, but it's also extremely important that to equally understand and recognize that relationships are mutual and influenced by human agency. And therefore, it's crucial to acknowledge that the relationships are always interpersonal, and being vulnerable does not exclude social agency or the responsibilities of boys and young men. Therefore, I think when we work with loneliness and we try to end loneliness, I think it's very important to keep this agency aspect in mind. It's not about being provided company that ends loneliness. It's about developing an in-depth understanding and supporting boys and young men of what it means to be a true friend. So we cannot end loneliness by company. We can end loneliness by helping men to be good friends. But my time is running up, so I have to make my concluding remarks. I've talked about what is gender sensitivity here, and I've used this kind of critical realist approach which acknowledges both the agency and the social structure side of realities. And I've stated that it's important that we recognize that all groups, also boys and young men, are conditioned by intersecting social structures. But I also stated that vulnerabilities are contextual. We have to understand vulnerabilities in social context. And lastly, I think it's extremely important that we don't overlook the fact that each of us bear through our agency a responsibility for our interactions with others. And that is my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Harri, for your more theoretical insights into working in particular with young boys and men and shifting to focus on vulnerabilities and the intersectional approach and also the context, which I thought was really interesting. We have a couple of questions at least addressed to your topic. So I'm just looking at the chat. There is one question regarding the work with men. What are the deepest gaps in the knowledge or skills of professionals at the moment? So how do you turn those concepts into practical work?
That's a very good question and very hard to answer with just on this short notice. But I think everything starts with acknowledging vulnerabilities and acknowledging that we need to work with men in a way where we recognize that things can be difficult for them. So it's not about just about doing everything as we used to do or using this kind of mainstream ideas. I think we have to be aware of the fact that it can be particularly difficult, for instance, in the welfare context for men to gain help. So I think this recognition of vulnerabilities is the main point I try to make here today.
Okay, so let's keep that in mind. So yes. Thank you very much, Harri. I'm now looking at the program as promised. We will have a small break after the second speaker, so now it's the time for it. And it's 13:54 Helsinki time, so we will come back at 13:59. So see you soon after a 5-minute break.
Welcome back. We will continue with our third speaker, Umberto Dorus Geerts from Estonia. Well, he's originally Dutch, but has lived in Estonia for over a decade. He represents here an Estonian organization VAITER, which aims to improve the state of mental health in Estonian society. Umberto himself is a social pedagogue by education and also has studied social policy. Men's mental health and parenting are two major topics that he encounters in his work on a daily basis. And VAITER, which he represents, has brought multiple local gender-based programs into Estonia. VAITER has localized these programs successfully, finding audiences for them and creating cooperative networks for those programs. Umberto's topic today is engaging men to work together in VAITER. Welcome, Umberto.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me and us as a VAITER. So I'll be talking about the two main programs that we have that we are using now in Estonia. So the organization that I'm representing now is VAITER. I will shortly talk more about VAITER itself and about the two programs. But as already Joonas mentioned, I'm myself Dutch, but now live in Estonia for already 10 to 15 years, I think already. I work in VAITER as a group leader for one program for divorced men and one program called Caring Dads. Next to this, I work also in another mental health organization where I work in general as a trainer and counselor, but also specifically with men. And next to this, in general, also with like parenting as such. At the moment, I'm in Tartu, which is a student town, and this is a school for special education where I work as a teacher, but also again with parents as well. So yes, can you please put the next slide? So a bit more about VAITER. It means Vaimsdarpse Ergonomische Competentiekeskus in my best Estonian. But what it is, it's a mental health developmental competence center. So we founded in 2018, and we're mostly focused on activities and services to prevent and minimize violence, domestic violence in general. The main programs are the Caring Dads, but also Women Without Violence, which we will not talk so much about today, but it's also a big part of our activities as well. And that's it. Yes. Can you please put the next slide as well? Yes. So there are a lot of logos here and shows the different organizations that we are cooperating with that have helped us to also implement these programs in Estonia through the different European programs as well. So there's also Miesakit that has helped also to train us and did the co-vision for the program for divorced men, and other organizations we have worked with or network organizations that we are part of. Yes. But now let's start to talk about the program itself. I think this is maybe the most interesting, to talk about the program shortly, and also like how we manage to get men, if we manage to get them, and like how the cooperation then goes. So please show the next slide. No, yes, this is the next slide, and this says something more about the organization. So some other general numbers and activities. So different trainings and services. There's quite some people that are involved with the organization. There's a few main people doing the project, and there are some specialists around it: therapists, social workers, social pedagogues, psychologists, family therapists, etc. And I think also this is useful during a different program where there might be a group leader, and then if there's any necessary or extra counseling needed for the participants, for the men, then we can see who in our organization has the best competencies to actually deal with specific questions that this person has. So I think this is definitely a positive thing. Yeah, that's it. So please show the next slide. Yes, so this is the Caring Dads program. This we have been doing already for quite some years, 5 years in Estonia, 70 groups. Each program, where each group lasts for 4 or 5 months. So the structure in general is that there's 60 meetings, group meetings, and some individual counseling as well with the dads. It is originally meant for men who already have perpetrated abusive or like neglective behavior. So there's already some kind of abuse happening, and a lot of these men come through court or through child protective services, which is quite a specific situation, because often these men did not choose to go there, and they don't not always want to be there in the first place. There might be conflict with the ex-wife, for example, maybe conflict about custody for the children, maybe some accusations of child abuse, of domestic violence. Next to this, And also I think this is a practice also maybe in Estonia more, is that there are also other dads that just want to be better dads, that do not like the way they're parenting, that are maybe not in conflict with their spouse, or there are no accusations of any violence, but they're just looking for a program that will help them to become better dads. So we have a mixed group, but I would say still the biggest part is men that come to the child protection services. There's different parts of the program which also take into account the nature of the target group. So very important is, of course, the first meeting, the first telephone calls, try to get people to get there, because it's actually quite hard to get people. Also in cooperation with the child protection services, etc., it's still very hard to get men. But if we get them, and this is very positive for us, then they usually stay. They hardly quit the program. So it's hard to get them, but if they are there, then they stay. There's different parts of the program also that are related to this. So the first weeks or the first month is mostly about trust and motivation, to build the trust, to like create this environment without any judgment. Afterwards, it's more about the awareness about my own behavior, about how this influences people around me or my own life, mental health. And after this, we go into this abusive and neglectful fathering. This part, but also in general, what is the positive side? How can I improve my behavior through this general cognitive behavioral therapy? So this very practical, like analysis of behavior, thoughts, patterns, etc. Yeah, and afterwards, of course, the last part of the program is mostly related to build up this trust in themselves and to make plans for the future. So that's a general structure. Very important is still the personal contact, I would say. The little breaks with pizza and cola, the little talks before the meetings, the like times when men call that they can't make it or that they're a bit early or a bit late. I think these little personal moments, especially specifically in this program, are very important to actually get the trust and to like create this relationship. Because the topics we're talking about there are also quite painful for them in different ways. So it is definitely an important point. The general key concepts, I think, that really may make this program work are also looking back to their own childhood, to their own relationship with their father and how this influences them, to kind of get this analysis or to kind of like understand the logic of things, where things come from. And I think this kind of rational, logical understanding of how things became like they are also helps quite a lot. Men put quite high standards on themselves, especially as fathers. In general, like I would say that if it was just about themselves, then they would even have less motivation to come for their own health or their own benefits. But if you take the view of a father or you use this, then I think that's something that to do the best they can for their children. And this is definitely an angle through which to approach also other topics like this self-compassion or like self-care that we know is so important also for people that want to make a change, whatever change in their life. So it's also about being a good parent, being a good enough parent. What are the expectations? What's my role? What are the expectations from society? What's possible? And again, I think this like validation and the self-compassion to really understand that, yes, I do not always act in the way that I want to. And sometimes things go really wrong, but I am still a good person and I am still a good person. These things can be true at the same time. And I think that this is very important topic that even in 4 months, you don't manage to do all the work, of course. But I think this difference between shame and guilt, is the behavior bad or am I a bad person? I think this is often so internalized already that this needs a lot of this detangling and kind of this self-care as well. And I think also this practical analysis of what I do, what's the next step? So this kind of practical analysis of the different situations, maybe at home, that they are not happy with. I think this definitely helps as well. Next to, of course, the thing that the men themselves mention the most, if you ask them in the end, what did you like the most? Then it's always the same answer. Like at least there's this very clear number one, which is to be here with other men, to understand that I'm not alone. There's also other men that are struggling. I thought I was the only one, but it turns out that I wasn't. to hear the different stories from the other men, that they could never imagine that it also could be like this or like that. Also to put their own situation into perspective, this is one, but also maybe to get some more ideas and like hints or like ways out for people. Maybe themselves, they have never thought about going to therapy, or they have had some bad experiences with family counseling and they would never like to go there anymore. But if there's somebody else that actually had a good experience or that has gone to therapy themselves and has found this quite useful, then this is something that they might also think about now. So I think this kind of peer level advice, or at least this kind of examples, also might help to interest people in some other like opportunities that they have. Next to this being together with other men, I think what's important also from the leaders and from the organization point of view is still this no judgment, especially when it's a situation where things might already have happened. Then I think this is something that that is very hard to do in the beginning, but that definitely works very well if they really feel that I am not judging you as a person. You are not a bad man, and this is a struggle you're going through. And I think this is quite a difficult thing. But then again, this like group process definitely helps a lot with this. So yeah, I think that's it. Yeah, I think we could move to the next program. If people have some questions, I can answer them in the end. So this was about the Caring Dads, a program that came from Canada that we integrated 5 years ago into the Estonian practice. Yes, thank you. Please, next slide. Yes, so this is also an important part of the work that people do in organizations. I have personally not done this, but it is the program Women Without Violence and Naist Vägivallata. So it's also something that helps women through individual and group work to prevent to like prevent the use of violence in their relationships at home, whatever it is, children, partners, parents, pets, etc. So this is a program specifically and only for women then. Yes. Let's move on to the next program, which is the divorce-related program. So in Estonian it's called lahutusest lahenduseni, which means from divorce to solution, which with the Estonian word play, it makes a lot of sense, which in Finnish, let's see, what was it? It's written there. It's so small now, I can't read it. I thought I can read it from the slides. Let's see, this will be very good. Erosta elosa, but exactly. So it's it's a cooperation with Miesaki through the European program that have trained us to do these activities and also have provided the co-vision for us in the last year or so, So in the meantime, we have done 3 programs, 2 in real life in sessions, and 1 was online. Very successful. Most men have come to us through social media, through general promotion that we do on like Facebook, etc. Also through email list. Some people have come through personal professional contacts. Maybe we knew them from different programs, or they have been sent by like somebody else, by some other professional that knew that it might be something for them. But mostly through social media. It's very interesting that the amount of time that has passed from the divorce to the time that people came to us is very different. So this program is meant for men that are in divorce crisis, to help them go through the divorce, to have some stabilization, to deal with the skills, also the sharing, get some perspective for the future. So it's 10 meetings that all together, plus some individual help as well in the middle. So that's how it practically looks like. Very concrete temas, like every time. And that's it. So the men that we had, because we did some research before and afterwards, some questionnaires, some more quantitative and also some more qualitative like information got from their results. The men that came somewhere through the biggest groups were men that were 3 to 6 months after their divorce, so quite recently. But the other big group was 2+ years after their divorce, even sometimes until 8 years after their divorce. So I think this is also interesting. Of course, the time directly after divorce is also the most sensitive time and the most important time if people are in crisis to like help them get through this. But at the same time, it was also very useful for men that already had been some longer time already managing their life after the divorce. We got very diverse people, socioeconomically very different, entrepreneurship through very different, from different parts of the country, city, village, very different. Also, their experience before was very different. Some people had already gone to therapy before, and this had been really helpful for them. Some guys had never thought about therapy before or any kind of psychological like intervention professionally. So in general, a very diverse group. And also here, luckily, the numbers are very good. When people came, then they also usually stayed. It is not as easy to find the men, especially when it's a paid service, but definitely the like interest is big. So it'll be very interesting to see how this will go on now in this year after the first 3 programs that we had now in the first period, because it's quite a new program for us as well. What came out, what the men themselves as well said, like how the program helped them or not. So the like biggest gains, the biggest difference before and after were related to the confidence in the divorce process, like how confident I am that I will get through this in a good way, that this will be solved, that I will manage the different situations or that I'm facing. And the other biggest improvement was about emotional coping, how able I am to cope emotionally with the situation, deal with myself and the difficulties that I have. So these were the highest by distance. And then also the mental health improvement in general, like my well-being, physical health as well, went up. And also the hopefulness for the future grew as well. And I think there's also one important aspect, because a lot of times when the marriage has ended, then and this was what you hoped for and this was your dream, then it's sometimes quite hard to see what else could be. Is this it or not? So I think also this kind of new perspectives are definitely something that that's an important part, and we definitely also focus on the, like in the end of the program. What men said, what was difficult, what was maybe an obstacle, why they didn't show up sometimes, why it was hard to be there, to do the homework, for example, or just to show up in the meetings. No, practical things mostly, logistical issues, also personal life challenges, things came up, whether it's work or in private life, and also emotional readiness. And I think this is also like an important aspect when and how to go through this. Yeah. What else? Some other points that they actually also reflected on later. We had like 7 most useful points that also the like men that themselves brought out in the interviews. And some are quite similar to the previous one, but there's also some other ones as well. So again, the shared experience and understanding, this I am not alone in the situation. Also the validation and emotion release. So somebody's there to validate my feelings and my emotions. It's okay, it's normal, no judgment. I think this is also very important. In the beginning, when we had these interviews before the session started, then we have this one-on-one interviews with the participants. Then, at least in my interviews, almost everybody asked the same question, but how many people will be there? And what about the other guys? To kind of understand, like, who is there and is it, what kind of environment will I put myself in? Because it can be quite a sensitive topic, of course. But then when we're there, then there's so much that people share that in my experience, this was not an issue at all. It went quite automatically, actually. if people are already sitting there in a circle, people are sharing, then this was something that really, really quickly came to the group, this kind of respect and kind of no judgment for each other's situations, because everybody understands it can be hard and it can be difficult, and you never know what somebody has gone through. So the no judgment as well. The new perspective and new ideas, I think this is also one thing, also because there's so many situations that other people have faced that you get inspired by or get some ideas by, whether it's the same professional help or some different solutions or things that people share. And I think this diverse group also somehow helps with these things. And then again, men sharing amongst themselves their experiences. And this is, of course, an important part of this type of group but that is that it's mostly a possibility for men that themselves to share their experiences and to go through different topics without somebody else, for example, the group leader, telling them how it should be or what they should do with their life. And this really works. The other one was the emotional calmness and healing. I'm okay with how I feel, and I think this is also something that came out. Some men said that I would have never thought that I could ever talk about these things to anybody, like in real life. And it's quite a big finding when you're 50, for example, or 60, and you realize that, wow, actually it's possible to talk about these things, and it's okay, and I can have these feelings, and it's okay to have them. And through this, there's also has a slight therapeutic function, of course, as well. And something else that like helped as well, I think, what men also brought out is this structured, calm, sober way of going through things, and then not sober in the way of not being drunk, but sober in this kind of clear, concrete, simple way. Not so many bells and whistles. There's a topic, let's talk about it. And I think this is something that men in general said they really appreciate, which also like helps to talk about the deep issues, but in this kind of structured, calm and sober way. Also, one thing that they manage is that they also realize their personal strength, what I actually can do, what are my interests, I can do it. I think this is also this important kind of realization of the man. Plus as well, the long-term usefulness, or how I would like to be things in the long term. So that's it. I think those were the things that the men mentioned the most. My time is up to 2 minutes over already, I think. But that's it. So these were what we are doing as an organization. The two main programs that we are running for men. One is the Caring Dads that came from Canada, and the other one was the Lahjoitukset lahendusteni, the program for divorced men from Finland. So that's it. If you have any questions, then I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you, Umberto. We have just a little time before the discussion, but if you could answer us about localization, as you are some kind of veterans in it, what kind of localization have you had to do with the programs when you are bringing them to Estonia?
I think for the program from Miesakik, that was from Finland, which is not so far away, 80 kilometers to Helsinki, I think we didn't have to do a lot of localization. I would say when it comes to the content and to the structure, to the approach by group leaders or also as such, I think this is something that we could take one-on-one directly into it. Maybe how to get the men, depending on our local network. I think this is the important part. Maybe how to get the men into the programs. I think this is important. Plus as well, how to provide this extra services or this counseling, depending on what organization you have behind you, or how the local system is built. So I think this is definitely something. When it comes to the Canadian program, I think that's very different because their welfare system is very different from ours. Also, there's fewer of these programs in Estonia. So I think with the Caring Dads, we have somehow took a broader scope of target group, so that we use the program in a broader way than maybe in other countries is meant next to other programs. And that our cooperation with other organizations dealing with the same topic or professionals is also less because there's less of these services. So then it's more of a standalone program as such. And in our case, I think it's also more of a stepping stone because it is one of the only or first like interventions that this specific target group, also when we talk about abuse, can go to. Then I think our program also functions as a stepping stone more than maybe in other countries. So after our program, they're actually willing and able to work further on themselves or on their or like other things. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. We now move on to discussion part of the event. We have about 25 minutes for questions and comments addressing all speakers and topics that we've heard today. If you have any questions, go on and ask them in the chat. And if you can address them to every participant here, that would be delightful. So let's start.
Okay, now we can move on to the end of our program. We're going to have, like Joonas said, we have about half an hour, 25 minutes to half an hour for our questions and answers and discussions, and we can dig a bit deeper in some of the topics. And I can tell you that the chat has been overflowing with questions and comments. And our colleagues on the other side of the studio have been moderating the chat, and they will let us know comments and questions to all of the speakers. But let's start with Antanas. Your presentation spurred a lot of discussions in the chat and many questions as well. You told us that your target group is mostly traditional cis heterosexual males, but you're also inclusive to all men. Whereas Harri's presentation focused on intersectionality and how that plays a role when we talk about men and boys. We have a question for Antanas, and it goes as follows. I really appreciate the idea of creating a space where men can share openly. Since there's no moderator and the facilitator leaves after the boot camp, how does the group ensure that conversations don't become an echo chamber where participants reinforce each other's perspectives without challenge? Is there a built-in way to encourage self-reflection? Can you answer that, Antanas?
Yeah, sure. Good question. And we get it quite often. So it is a peer-to-peer support group with the focus on emotional work. And ingrained in that is the group norm of being honest, talking openly, having an honest discussion. So what needs to happen for there to be echo chamber? There needs to be lack of safety and lack of honesty. Because, of course, if men start talking about, I don't know, man's role in a relationship, for example, and if someone brings up a traditionally masculine answer, what his role should be, there will most likely be someone in the group who will start questioning that. Because that's the normal process of a group that is focused on emotional work. On the other hand, of course, it's not perfect. There is no perfect supervision for such groups. But we're still confident that in essence, it helps most men. And, even with supervision, psychotherapy is not perfect. And there are sometimes there are bad cases of psychotherapy between psychotherapist and the client. So the same applies to peer-to-peer support groups. So it's not perfect. It's just one way to help and empower men in emotional lives. And I think it does a good start.
Thank you, Antanas. I think you're perfectly right to say that it's an ongoing process. And I think that applies to all the examples that we've heard today, that we're all trying to develop different perspectives and to make them better and improve our work. Joonas, do you want to ask a question? Because I have one in my back pocket for Umberto, but if you have one, go ahead.
Well, I'd like to hear from all of you. There were questions about the courage here. and loneliness. How do you think that this interplay of loneliness and masculine courage can be used in getting men to help each other and themselves? Umberto, would you like to start?
Yes, so loneliness and courage as main topics. I think you're definitely right, and I think this is something that I can only confirm. I unfortunately didn't see the previous presentations, but I can definitely confirm that loneliness is an important topic, and that and the courage as well. I think it's very hard to be vulnerable, and I think it's mostly about the courage to be vulnerable as well, and to have the positive experience in the way that if you show the courage to open up and to like show up and open up, regardless of what you have done before or how happy you are with how things have been, but you have to, if you show up and you open up, then it's about what you bring to the table in that moment. And I think if men get this experience, then that's definitely something that right away translates into something positive within the group, I would say. That is an example for other people, but also as an accelerator for the group process to happen and people starting to share this thing as well. And I think, but that definitely needs some kind of self-compassion to be able to be so courageous, I think. Yeah. My ideas.
Yeah, I think this is overall an extremely important and interesting question in this time, because I think something is happening globally when it comes to men's or to the recognition of the vulnerabilities of men and masculinities. And I think there's a new culture where we are developing ways of acknowledging that side of us, and I think that's extremely healthy. And I think when it comes to men and masculinities, we are often talking about things are going in the wrong direction, but I think this is one part that is actually going to the right direction, and that is how I perceive it. And I think this construction that it's a matter of courage, I think that's a very good one. And I think we should go forward in regards to that acknowledge that it's not pathetic to be lonely. It's a circumstance that is very unfortunate. Mm-hmm. It's a circumstance that is very common, I think, and I think it's also a circumstance, and I'm perhaps talking more about middle-aged men who has like their jobs and their families, and we have kind of this. I think we have ignored the fact that to maintain relationships, you need to maintain them, and do things like that before it reaches the state that it becomes very sad. But I think to change whole this way of ending the marginalization of men, I think it's very good that we like talk in these terms like vulnerability. It's not pathetic; it's vulnerable. It's about courage, and overall like actively change the discourses to something else. And I don't think men benefit from victimization. I very much like the tribe talk, which is very much about doing things together. Like energizing each other, and I think that's a very good way going forward. Because the problem with loneliness, then again, which I didn't perhaps have time to talk in depth about, because the problem if we start understanding men's problems as something that they cannot help themselves with, I think that's a high risk, because I think that can involve mechanisms that makes men even more marginalized. So I think we need to empower men through this kind of a positive discourses.
Antanas.
I agree with my colleagues. Talking about courage is a great way to motivate men to do emotional work and to explore vulnerability. That works for us. For example, we have quite a few advertisements where we use this wording. Create courage to look inside yourself. Dare to look inside yourself. So that's good for motivating men to start exploring, because they want to be courageous. On the other side, I think it's important to link courage with compassion, because if we only focus on courage, then essentially we're saying it's all in your hands. It's only the matter of are you courageous or not that you are lonely. If you're lonely, that means you're fearful. And if you would be more courageous, then you would have more friends and social links. So I think we also need to not only promote courage, but also to give compassion that, look, man, it is really tough. It's really tough to make new connections. And it's tough because you haven't been taught how to do that from early age. And it's also tough because we live in this individualistic culture where we live in our silos with our screens in front of us. And it's really hard to penetrate that. So still be courageous, go forward, try, do your best, and let's support each other along the way. But also we have compassion for you. It's tough.
Thank you, Antanas. I have actually a question for all three of you. Harri, you said you want to promote positive discourse. We want to, or you in your examples focused on the notions of vulnerabilities and courage, and how you want to sort of build that in your definition of masculinity, sort of that is empowering for men and boys. But I would like to hear your views that what is your strategy in the face of that the popular culture, the media, the massive entertainment industry is producing very sort of rigid and stereotypical images related to how to be a man and a boy or a woman and girl or any gender. How can you provide a counter strategy to that? Because the volume of that kind of popular culture and the narratives that are being reproduced through in social media, films, games, that's not necessarily very beneficial for gender equality, men or women. So what are your views on this? Who wants to start?
Well, I can start by just, I think there are obviously strong stereotypes in society, and that's a fact. But I don't think all culture is not producing only bad stereotypes. And when I look at what has like the biggest change when it comes to being a man, when I compare my life as a 47-year-old and, for instance, to my father's generation, I think there has been a huge shift in the concept of fatherhood. I think we have more access to fatherhood, my generation, and that my father had. He wasn't around when I was when my mother gave birth to me. He wasn't in the same room, whereas I have had the luxury to go baby swimming and have like this embodied parenthood, and we're very much closeness. So things are going forward, I think, in society. But I think one thing which I encourage people or how I encourage people to come into equality work is to try to ignore the construction of hierarchies. Because I think many men had this belief that equality work is not for them, it's for someone else. And I think once you understand that equality is about equality for everyone, then you can be in a way much more involved. And I don't think being an academic or a scholar working on masculinities, I don't feel that I'm working against anyone. And I really don't think that my work would somehow be ignoring girls or women or other minorities. Because I think the way I work with gender equality with boys and young men, I work in a way that everybody can, in a way, benefit from that. And when I, for instance, have explored boyhood, I have also interviewed girls, and they are not interviewed as competitioners to boys. They are interviewed as girlfriends, as sisters, as friends who can express ideas in solidarity. And for me, equality movement is and should be a solidarity movement. It's not a competition.
Any reflections from Antanas or Umberto?
I think it's definitely has a big influence what kind of relationships and like roles the people perceive through social media, movies, also like in the system in general. Also, when you look at the parenting or relationship people have, a lot of it is about expectations from other people, like expectations about yourselves, how you should act, how this relationship should look like, but also from other people, how your spouse expects you to react, how society expects you to expect, and these expectations are not always very realistic. So I think this is one important element as well, also for them to understand that there's a reason why people have certain expectations and where they come from, so they also see the bigger picture. That isn't not only about them, but there's logic behind it. I think this helps definitely, and I think those really starts about the good relationship with yourself. I think especially when it's about these divorce groups, then a lot of men, in my experience, have quite this romantic, idealistic picture of this is the girl I met, and now I marry her, and now maybe we have a child, and this is it. But then it turns out that doesn't always work out like that in real life. So I think this also this different understanding about intimacy or relationship, that it's about having a good relationship with yourself. Friendship and love can be a lot bigger and more than only this one picture perfect marriage that you have. There's friends, there's other things around you, there's the world. And if you are happy with yourself and with things around you, you have this friendship and love, then you will also find this other person. So I think this kind of picture perfect marriage that they're looking for, because then they expect to be happy. I think there's a lot of this kind of realistic thinking that happens in some moment that maybe it doesn't work out. If you look at the numbers, that only half the marriage work out, but what does it mean? So to kind of more find themselves and understand what makes me happy and what do I need and what can I give to somebody. And then even this maybe not perfect picture relationship actually turns out to be a place where I can be much happier than before. I think these are some important elements. Yeah? Mm-hmm.
Antanas, your reflections.
As a mental health professional, I would reframe the problem. For me, it's not so much to oppose and fight the social media and the media in general with their reinforcement of stereotypes. For me, it's about creating positive examples how men can adaptively deal with emotional pain, because I see that as a problem. That men suffer, and when they suffer, they often create suffering for others. And they suffer because most often they don't have tools, coping strategies, skills, how to deal with emotions and emotional pain. And we still lack good examples and role models how men and boys can deal with emotional pain. So that is my focus. And that is how I try to counteract that trend in media, to create more positive examples how men can actually effectively deal with emotional pain.
Thank you. We have some questions on the chat. Should we take a couple from there?
Yeah. Well, there's a question. Despite being a men's organization, our social media followers are predominantly women between the ages of 30 and 45. How can we reach men, and specifically young men? What are your experiences on this?
Who wants to start?
Well, there was. If we go to Antanas, there was a complaint that all your people in pictures were young men. So how do you?
Well, we have more pictures. It's just pictures I chose for my presentation. But of course, we are conscious that we include various different types of men to be more relatable. And it is a thing that most followers in social media quite often are women. And if we want, as a man organization, to reach men, of course, we have to be relatable. So in my presentation, I mentioned few things that usually antagonize men. So if we talk only about men in crisis that antagonizes, we need to also talk about positive psychology and about positive aspects of taking care of yourself. If we criticize masculinity, men won't listen. The majority of them won't. only those who are super aware and open-minded, only then will listen. So we need to have male positive messages and humor, playfulness. When we advertise, we use our advertisements as themes from video games. We use jokes. When we have trolls commenting under our posts, we troll back in a friendly banter. So that creates some sparks and some connections with a lot of men. This is how men are used to relate, and this is what they enjoy. But it's hard. It's you need, just as you need to tailor your services, for example, to adolescents, and the same goes with adult men. You need to tailor your message.
Yeah, no, I think this is a very good question that needs to be like explored and researched. At how do you actually reach them? I think men are a minority on Facebook and Instagram. That's just how it is. But I wonder if your organization is on Discord, which I've learned just recently, which I think is a more male-dominant platform overall. Same perhaps goes for Reddit. I'm not an expert, but I believe. So if you really like try to start to thinking in those terms that how should we reach out to them, then we perhaps have to think about specific ways, specific channels, specific content that men are gravitated towards. And then I also think that for many men, I think issues in regarding equality and welfare and so forth are often dealt on the side. Many men that I've talked to have this experience, for instance, how men deal with their issues. They do something together, and then on the side, they talk also about the serious stuff. And I think this concept is something that is very important when it comes to reaching out to men. I think it's good to have different kinds of activities, and then these side activities. Me working as a social worker, when I worked in adult services, I had men who came to me with their economical issues, which was a very good excuse to meet me. But then on the side, we also talked about other stuff, such as emotions. So I really much encourage you to explore this and really try different kinds of approaches, different kinds of channels, and different kinds of collaborations within the social media context, hockey teams, sports teams, and so forth, which are places where men go. And I think you can be more successful if you try out different things.
So it's not just how, but where.
Yeah.
Is it also that we need to increase the volume of it? Because
I think we should try various things because men are in places in societies. They still gather somewhere. So perhaps we cannot think that this general social media approach would be like one size fit all, that we perhaps have to be more creative. Because the fact is that there are social media channels that are extremely successful of engaging with men. And I think that's in a way quite scary, but we could also look at what do they do right in their approach. And one thing what I think they do right is, and I'm talking about certain internet profiles that are very popular among men. What they do is they talk directly to men, not as something, not about welfare in general or something. They talk directly and look in the camera and try to engage that listener over there. I think that's a very important aspect as well. But I don't know. We should try different ways.
Umberto, what have you learned about reaching men?
Yeah, that it's difficult and that it's important to target them directly. Different things like fatherhood, that's an easier one because through fatherhood then people are engaged, and then you can also talk about different topics like the previous speaker mentioned. To be concrete and direct, I think this is a topic to be solution-based. I think in general, this is something that maybe works better, to be very concrete and know what it's about and what you're there for, what's in it for me as well. as kind of a concrete idea of what it means, instead of just talking about it, but what's the point of it, maybe as well. And I think also where to do it. I think some places where I've gotten definitely a bigger balance between men and women in general is also when doing things like also before mentioned, like going hiking with somebody, like having this like mental health hikes we had, and then the majority was different like this. That may be interesting that you can do also like as a group that actually functions as well for people. We've also thought about educating barbers and like hairdressers. So where else do men sit still and talk about their life? So finding out where are these men and what do they do? Of course, you cannot go to sauna with them as well from the beginning. But I think this is definitely something to think about as well. Where do you find these men? Whether it's on social media or in real life. But I think also the general, also when it's about the design of things like the posters and the thing, I think sometimes this whole mental health field can be quite female dominated as well. Also the examples. I think once I watched through one of my presentations and then I exampled all the examples of or all the pictures or all the people that we showed that were speaking on YouTube were mostly female. So I think all this kind of this representation is also a very important aspect in the content. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I'm just looking at the time. I'm keeping with the time. I wonder if we have time for one last question, or should we maybe move on to have maybe it's the last round. So if there's one message you would like to share with the audience today as their takeaway from this webinar, what would that be?
Your last good practice for others to learn from this day.
Who wants to start?
I can start. I think the one thing that Antanas, yes. I will start. There's one thing that has come up in the last month of my work a lot, and that is to not underestimate or like not to expect men to not care or not be interested. Just to ask directly. What do you want to talk about? Ask how they're feeling, and then they actually might answer, and they actually answer honestly and to the point. And I think a lot of times we forget to ask because maybe it's difficult, or maybe they don't care, or maybe they don't know about the kids or about something else or about themselves. But if you ask directly, they will actually answer.
Antanas.
Yeah, thank you. So if the main question of today's webinar is how to reach men in order to empower men, then my suggestion first is make sure you're not only speaking about men, but you're speaking to men. So when we do posts, when we do, media campaigns, make sure you're not only talking about men and about men's problems, you're talking to men about their problems. And one tip that we are using, I try to use every time, I try to imagine a very specific man from my own life that I know. And I ask myself, how should I reach that man? How should I use the wording so that that man would listen? And it would be much more effective than speaking abstractly about all men or just mainstream men or traditional men or just men in crisis, but think about a specific person and how should I address him. So that's my suggestion.
Yeah, I could go on from that. Not just about men, not only to men, but also with men. And I think that comes to this very important listening part, that we have to also listen to what men has to say. The fact is that when I've conducted interviews with young masculinities, there is this discourse or this practice of or warning researchers that this will never work because boys can't talk, yada, 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 yada. But all researchers that I know of, when they have started to talk with boys, boys often talk a lot and they explain that they enjoyed it very much. They also say that this is perhaps the first time anyone has taken me seriously. So I think this engaging with men and creating spaces and moments for dialogue is very, very crucial. And I think we are going in a way in the right direction. But I guess we just have to continue and do more. Yeah.
Thank you, Harri. Thank you for the concluding observations, and thank you all. I think we're coming to an end of our webinar now. So I think, first of all, I want to thank all our excellent speakers, Harri, Antanas, Umberto, for your presentations and your excellent contributions. And I also want to thank our participants for all the questions and comments. We're very sorry we're not able to address all the comments that came through, but there were plenty of them and we'll take note of them. And before we close, Joonas, maybe we'll say something about our next event.
Yes. Well, as you all know, hopefully know, this is part one of three webinars. And the next webinar will take place 23rd of April at the same time. And the next webinar will focus on practical work with men in crisis situations and how to support men in coping with such situations. If you haven't registered yet, then do so. Of course, if you have people who might be interested, spread the message so that you or they won't miss that. And, well, this concludes this webinar. Thank you for participation and see you in a month.